Merry Christmas, and may you avoid the wrath of Krampus, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, InaneDragon, and this is our last actual video before I take a much-needed break from being productive. Don't worry, to fill up your weekly shitty video quota, I've got a small pile of guest hosts, to stand in for me for the next few weeks. More about that at the end of the video. For now, I have to offer a trigger warning. Today's fucktard pissed me off every time I watched the video. It's not because he has a different opinion, or that he's all that hard to debunk. He's actually pretty trivial to debunk. It's because to have some of the information he presents as evidence against evolution, he has to know evolutionary theory well enough to know that his evidence is considered evidence in favor of evolution. That's right. This fucking asshole has the balls to come out and knowingly lie about how the evidence is used. I'd be fine if he tried to argue that it should be evidence against and explained why it doesn't work as evidence for evolution. I'd debunk his ass and move on. But he doesn't. He willfully ignores and misrepresents the science to support his conclusions. For my religious followers, it's fucking shit for brains like this that ultimately create the rabid anti-theists of the world. If his claims were allowed to gain traction, it would ultimately lead to the undermining of science. And science, my friends, is what gives us all those nice things that separate us from a post-apocalyptic hellhole. I can't lie, when anti-scientific ideas like this fuck catch on, it has more potential to do long-term harm to civilization than all of the suicide bombers in the Middle East. The reason the migrant crisis in Europe is a serious problem is they bring a culture and belief system that is rife with this sort of backwards bullshit, a culture that thrives off of it. Now that I've thoroughly poisoned the well, because honestly, fuck this guy, let's meet our guest.
In order for the evolutionary paradigm to be able to explain the history of life on Earth, the fossil record needs to look a certain way. The fossil record needs to display gradual evolutionary transformations where one major group is transitioning to another major group, and that these transitions need to be characterized by numerous transitional intermediate forms. These are features that flow from the evolutionary paradigm. These represent predictions, if you will, for evolution to be valid. Yet when we look at the fossil record, we see that instead of seeing gradual evolutionary change, we see sudden appearance of new forms, new major groups, followed by vast periods of time where those groups are unchanged. That is, they remain static, or they display stasis.
So already he's a lying son of a two-bit whore bitch. I'm sorry to insult someone's mama, but sometimes it has to be done. As we understand evolutionary theory today, we expect to see both periods of change and periods of stasis. Why? Because there are often long periods of time where the evolutionary pressures aren't changing, so a well-adapted species will not undergo significant change during that time. This is called punctuated equilibrium, and later he's going to quote mine Stephen J Gould's rhetorical introduction of this term. It's worth knowing that there's good reason to believe, reading on the origin of species, that even Darwin accepted this notion, even if he didn't have a name for it. Moreover, what we see in the fossil record for many species is that both occur. We have sets of fossils showing the slow progression gradually over time from a land animal similar to a hippo into modern-day whales. We can do this again for the evolution of the horse, for the transition from fish to amphibians, through the amazing fossil Tiktaalik and its cousins, uncles, and nephews. Now, an important aspect of the fossil record is we have no way of proving that a given fossil is the ancestor of another fossil. What we can do is show relative relationships, that a given fossil is, if not the direct ancestor, then cousin to the direct ancestor of another fossil. As such, I'll use language like the above, cousin, uncle, nephew, to refer to relationships. It may be that we're looking at something so many generations great father, but it's unlikely. The fossil record is in no way that perfect. But if there's no evolutionary pressure on a particular group, well, dinosaurs can rule the world for millions of years. And even then, when we look closely at the details, we see specific sets of dinosaurs going through their own independent evolution during this same time of stasis. To claim that we have long periods of stasis as if it were a global phenomena is an outright lie, which leads us directly to his next lie.
We also see a near absence of transitional intermediates in the fossil record as well. These two features run counter to the predictions and the expectations of the evolutionary model.
See, I just gave you 3 examples of transitional sequences a minute ago, and it's worth pointing out that Everything is transitional between its parent and its child. Look at your mom and dad. Look at yourself. Are they the same as you are in every particular? Look at your son or daughter, if you're so cursed. Do they look the same as you in every particular? No? Congratulations, you represent the transitional form between your parents and your children. It's the same when you're looking at fossils. Every pile of bones we dig up is the child of something. It may have been the parent of something else. And over millions of years, the differences between ancestor and descendant pile up. That's evolution for you. Done. So we've got transitional fossils. They're every single fossil ever discovered. But back to his straw man. We've also got transitional sequences for hominids, that's us. And he's going to show a wonderful set of transitional fossils from non-avian dinosaurs to avian dinosaurs in his attempt to use Archaeopteryx as evidence for creation. Key to all of this is that we don't always have the direct grandparent, parent, child, grandchild series of fossils. We have representative fossils from various groups that show features later to be seen in groups believed to be descended from them. Then taxonomists fuck everything up by trying to put names and groupings to all of these, and the creationists abuse the hell out of it. You'll see what I mean later. For now, let's see if he can't stop bullshitting us.
And Charles Darwin, when he wrote his book On the Origin of Species, lamented the fact that the fossil record did not display transitional forms. And in fact, even today, 150 years later, we still see a fossil record that lacks, for all intents and purposes, transitional intermediates. For example, the late paleontologist Stephen J. Gould said all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt.
See, this is called quote mining, which he slaps on the beginning and end of a reiteration that we lack transitional forms even after I've laid out just a few of the examples we have. And again, every fossil is transitional between something and something else. As for the quote mining, it just so happens that I have On the Origin of Species, though I don't have the Gould book, which he's also mining. In the first case, it's true. In Darwin's time, with paleontology still in the cradle and not that many fossils on Earth, and much of the globe unexplored by paleontologists, we had a very incomplete fossil record. As a good scientist, Darwin brought this up not just in one chapter, but in several chapters of his seminal work. He cited it as one of the biggest challenges to his theory. Of course, he went on to make predictions about what would be discovered in the fossil record as paleontologists got their asses in gear. Most notably, that the predecessors of mankind would be found in Africa. Lo and behold, this is exactly what we found, and in so doing, we developed one of the most complete and perfect chains of transitional forms that anyone could ever ask for, ranging from the earliest Australopithecines through to modern man. But not only that, he laid out a hypothesis for why we have so few, namely that the particulars of fossilization lead it to being a rare phenomenon, and the idea that most change happens in relatively short time frames, reducing the odds of fossilizing the transitional forms. Which, incidentally, means that the original claim that we wouldn't expect to see large periods of stasis intermixed with brief periods of explosions and diversity every so often has been wrong ever since the theory was first proposed. Which brings us to his quote mining of Gould. In the 80s, Gould decided to emphasize the notion that organisms would maintain stasis for long periods of time until something pushed them to evolve, say a wild change in climate, migration to a new environment, or a natural disaster. This push would then compel the rapid evolution and diversification of new species from the parent organisms in a short period of time. Due to this rapid evolutionary period, most of the transitional forms wouldn't be fossilized, as stated above, due to the rarity of the conditions necessary for fossilization and the transitional forms' relatively brief existence before being supplanted by the fully adapted forms of their descendants. For various reasons, Gould felt that this was a novel addition to the theory of evolution instead of just a formalization of what Darwin and others had already described, and he called it punctuated equilibrium. To push this idea of his, he produced books and interviews, including the book The Panda's Thumb, from which this quote is mined. In context, it's clear that he's not suggesting we lack transitional fossils, or that evolutionary theory doesn't work. Rather, that what he called gradualistic evolution needed to be replaced with punctuated equilibrium. Several biologists, including Dawkins, have challenged Gould's characterization of this gradualist theory as a straw man and warned that creationists would quote mine Gould's arguments to claim that the fossil record doesn't show what it plainly shows. And so, 3 decades later, we have this asshole. Give me a fucking break and stop lying and misrepresenting your opposition's arguments.
Yet evolutionary biologists, in spite of these general features with regard to the fossil record, are still convinced that evolution can account for life's history and the diversity of life that we see today. And they point to a few instances of what appear to be transitional forms to justify, to validate their expectation that life's history can be explained by biological evolution.
Few instances of transitional fossils, you fucking moronic piece of shit scumbag! I've offered half a dozen and I'm not even a biologist. I spent minimal time researching to find them too, and each chain of fossils I've discussed covers multiple fossils, all of which are transitions from an ancestor to a descendant. See, I could stop here, point out that you don't know what you're talking about, and walk away. But here's the thing, you're plainly well educated on this subject. You do know what you're talking about, and you're saying the opposite nonetheless. I sometimes wish your God existed just so that you would burn in hell for bearing false witness in your God's name. Do I need to drag forth even more examples? You know what, people? Down in the descriptions are some fucking books by actual fucking biologists. If you genuinely care about this debate, pick them up and read them. And those are just 3. There are dozens more. For fuck's sake, on the question of transitioning from aquatic to land animals, a group of biologists considered where and when the transitionary forms would exist. They went a step further and speculated on what one such form would look like. They predicted, based on evolutionary theory, that it would show up in a swamp from the late Devonian period. Scroll forward a little ways in time, and a fossil bed dated to the late Devonian with swampy characteristics was discovered in Canada. These fuckers packed their shit and put their lives where their mouths were. After several years of work in the Arctic, they discovered a fossil now known around the world as Tiktaalik rosei. Not only did it appear in the right environment and at the right point in time, but it even came close to matching predictions about the skeletal structure. Put that in your creationist pipe and smoke it. That's exactly the sort of thing any scientist wants as proof that their theory is correct. And better yet, subsequent digs have found additional fossils, not only of Tiktaalik, but of ancestors and descendants, that show us a beautiful flow from fish-like ancestor to amphibian-like descendant. So maybe you should shut the hell up about there not being much evidence. The theory is not only supported by the evidence, it makes accurate goddamn predictions. You lying sack of shit hypocrite!
And one of these classic transitional forms that scientists like to point to is Archaeopteryx, which appears about 155 million years ago in the fossil record. And many people argue that Archaeopteryx appears to be a midpoint between reptiles and birds. This is the common understanding that people have of Archaeopteryx.
Well, not really reptiles and birds, because reptiles isn't a proper clade and isn't really used taxonomically anymore. Yes, it gets used colloquially, and we will do that later, but we get your meaning. It's touted as an example of a descendant from non-avian dinosaurs, which could be an ancestor to avian dinosaurs, what we call birds. And it is exactly that. We have good reason to believe it's not the direct ancestor of any modern bird, but a cousin of that ancestor. I'll leave that for some other video, though. Here's the thing. The Archaeopteryx looks exactly like other theropods, the group of dinosaurs to which it belongs, except that its feathers are rather pronounced and developed for flight, and it has a backward-facing thumb on its hind limbs like a modern bird. Beyond that, it has the jaws with teeth, not a beak, and the general skeletal structure of typical theropods. It's a perfect transitional fossil, even if it isn't the direct ancestor of modern birds. But you're gonna lie again and play like biologists present it as the direct ancestor, aren't you? You actually think these names have any meaning other than a convenient classification system of similar animals by taxonomists, don't you? Fuck it. Lie to us, baby. Lie to us.
Yet the fact of the matter is, Archaeopteryx is a true bird. It's an ancient bird. It belongs to a group known as the Archaeopteryx, but nevertheless it is a true bird. And it appears quite suddenly in the fossil record without any true transitional form leading up to it.
So there you have it. It belongs to an ancient family of birds which has no other members, meaning that it died out and isn't the progenitor of modern birds. So now all of this is taxonomy, which, if he's using as part of an argument, he needs to use consistently. He's going to play word games and lie to us here. He's going to contrast Archaeopteryx against Theropods, but as he said, Archaeopteryx is a member of the family Archaeopterycoidea, which is a member of Avialia, the clade that includes all birds. What do you bet Avialia is a member clade of? $10 to the lady in the back. That's right. Avialia is a member of the suborder Theropodia. If you are going to argue that taxonomical classification has any meaning for your argument, you have to accept that Archaeopteryx isn't just a bird. It's also a theropod. All birds are theropods based on taxonomy. And right now, that's all you're arguing from is taxonomy. This fucker is saying Archaeopteryx is classified as the first true bird. That's correct. It is the oldest known member of the clade Avialia, which is the clade commonly referred to as birds. Of course, it's only the oldest known member because it's the oldest fossil with sufficient avian characteristics for most taxonomists to classify it as Avialia. Doesn't mean there weren't progenitor birds for which we have not yet found fossils. And he's going to rest a whole hell of a lot on this taxonomy. The crux of his argument is going to be, look at these other theropods with bird-like features. They're younger than the oldest known bird, but again, we never know the true ancestor-descendant relationship for certain, and furthermore, species don't necessarily go extinct when descendant species emerge from them. The evolution of mankind from one subset of apes does not preclude the continued existence and evolution of other apes. Fuck it! Surely he's got more to say that'll demonstrate he's making an honest argument.
Now, for many years, scientists thought that the way to explain the origin of birds is that they evolved from a reptile known as a Thecodont. That the idea here is that these types of ancient reptiles gave rise to birds. But the problem is there's a 100 million year gap between Thecodont appearance in the fossil record and when Archaeopteryx appears, and there are no transitional forms connecting this ancient reptile to the very first birds. Moreover, Thecodonts and birds really lack similar characteristics to each other, again undermining the idea that there's an evolutionary connection between these reptiles and birds. In more recent years, scientists have argued that the transitional form that produced birds would be feathered dinosaurs that belong to a group known as the Theropods. These would be dinosaurs that walk around on two legs, that is, they would be bipedal dinosaurs that look like the raptors that people are familiar with in Jurassic Park. And the argument goes something like this. The theropod dinosaurs have a number of shared anatomical characteristics with birds. Some of them appear to possess feathers. They have other features of their anatomy that connects them to birds, and they even nest, laying eggs and produce nests similar to what birds would do. And so the argument is that these theropod dinosaurs evolved to give rise to birds.
Okay, so Theory 1 hasn't been in vogue for decades, if not even longer. The last time the term Thecodontia was even used seriously was 1988, and that was using the already outdated Linnaean taxonomy. Moreover, even when it was popular, you completely misrepresent it, the same way you misrepresent the idea that Archaeopteryx isn't a theropod in taxonomy. Thecodontia wasn't a single reptilian species that existed 100 million years ago. It was the classification in Linnaean taxonomy, as well as some older cladistic taxonomies, for all reptilian creatures whose teeth are set in sockets. In these taxonomies, Thecodontia were the ancestors of all dinosaurs, as well as crocodiles and several other animal groups, with species going back as much as 252 million years or more. The picture you've got as your Thecodont is actually the Rutiodon, which was never considered as a possible ancestor of birds. So since Thecodontia is a no longer used term for a group of species that includes the ancestors of theropods, your two theories are really just one theory, updated nomenclature. The Differences being that we stopped using the term Thecodontia as a taxonomical grouping. Congrats on that attempt to mislead people. As to your second theory, the evidence for which will consume pretty much the rest of this video, those similarities have already been perfectly illustrated earlier with the Archaeopteryx, where the only evidence differences are the style of the feathers and the orientation of the thumb on the hind limbs. Otherwise, it's a classical theropod fossil. Keep in mind, he's trying to get you to think raptor from Jurassic Park when he talks about theropods. But T-Rex and those little compy things that bite the girl in the beginning of The Lost World are also theropods. There's a huge range of variety in this classification. Don't let him fool you when he talks about comparing fossils later.
Now, to justify this model, there needs to be, again, transitional forms in the fossil record that, again, connect theropod dinosaurs to birds, to Archaeopteryx, which again appears at 155 million years ago in the fossil record. And in recent years, scientists have discovered a number of sites where there are feathered dinosaurs, what appear to be feathered dinosaurs, feathered theropods in the fossil record. One site is in China that dates at about 125 million years ago that has yielded a number of very interesting feathered dinosaurs. And people argue that these feathered dinosaurs represent the transitional forms that document this transition from, again, a theropod dinosaur to the very first bird, Archaeopteryx. The problem with this explanation, however, is something known as the temporal paradox, in which you have transitional forms appearing in the fossil record after the forms that they are supposed to have evolved into.
No, this isn't the problem. The problem is how you misrepresent the evidence in the relationships. Archaeopteryx is taxonomically considered the earliest bird. It is not, however, the ancestor of modern birds. That means there's some other animal, some other theropod in this model, which gave rise to both Archaeopteryx and other species of bird. Now again, I have to remind people that we will never have a complete fossil record unless there's a god and he blesses us with one. Or would that be curses us? That'd be a lot of bones to sort. We will never be able to know for certain if we found all of the right fossils to show a direct lineage. No biologist ever expects to be able to do so, and thus we speak of cousinship, of uncles and nephews. Archaeopteryx is an uncle of modern birds, and these other theropods with bird-like traits are Archaeopteryx's cousins. They demonstrate that Archaeopteryx's father, whoever he is, would easily have traits consistent with both their fathers and uncles, but with the many thousands of great-grandchildren of his, the modern birds. It is not necessary, given the limits of fossilization, to find a theropod sporting all the features of theropods and all the features of modern birds. If you found a red-headed kid with blue eyes and pale skin, do you presume him to be related to the family where some people have red hair, others blue eyes, and various shades of skin, including a fairly pale tone? Or is he the son of that Japanese family across the street? Odds are damned good he's more closely related to the former than the latter. And when we look at the fossil record, that's what we find. Cousins who nest. Cousins with flight feathers or downy feathers. Cousins with beaks. Cousins that you'd mistake for a fucking chicken. And we say, maybe these creatures who nest have flight and down feathers, beaks, are more closely related to these fuckers than they are related to a goddamn bat and its ancestors. The reason Archaeopteryx is trotted out as the singular transitional fossil isn't because it actually lies between all non-avian theropods and all birds, but because it beautifully embodies the combination of traits that creationists want in a crocoduck. It's got a mouthful of reptilian teeth, but fucking bird wings! Its entire chest cavity is practically a copy-paste job from the typical theropod, yet it has the back-turned thumb of a perching bird. What fucking more could you goddamned ignoramuses want from us? A fucking sign from God saying if a crocodile fucked a duck, this is what you get! No, the other transitional fossil examples do not have to form a chronological line to suggest relationships. It's just ideal when that happens. It's not like a species just disappears when something evolves from it, you fucking moron!
Also, some people have questioned whether or not the feathers associated with these feathered dinosaurs are actually true feathers. Some people have argued they may be artifacts of the preservation process that the fossils underwent from the time that the organism died to the time that paleontologists recover those fossils in the geological column. And the argument is that these are not true feathers, but actually may be frayed skin, frayed integument.
Some people, I'm sure you have a beautiful list of citations for... fuck! You didn't cite anything, you fucking lying sack of shit! Carry on! I'm sure you'll never say some people again to weasel out of justifying shit.
Some people have argued that what are being interpreted as feathered theropods are actually flightless birds. Archaeopteryx is one example that was originally interpreted as a theropod is now understood to be a flightless bird. The whole point here is that while this idea of birds evolving from theropods is rather intriguing, and it's true you can point to what appear to be perhaps feathered theropods in the fossil record, these all appear after, again, the first true bird, Archaeopteryx, appears.
And here's the glorious thing you're omitting here. If people can't all agree whether a thing should be classified as a bird or a theropod, ignoring for the moment that these same people argue that all birds are theropods, isn't that exactly what you want for transitional fossils? Nothing will ever appear in a museum with the scientific designation half bird, half theropod. Taxonomists will conduct whatever studies they have, apply whatever formulae they use, to force each fossil found into a specific singular classification. So maybe Archaeopteryx is a bird, maybe it's not. It's all a matter of a human-imposed definition, not nature. Maybe these other fossils are birds. Maybe they aren't. Same fucking thing. And beautifully, that confusion is exactly what evolutionary theory predicts. These are animals that are so much like non-avian theropods, and yet so much like avian theropods that we can't decide which they are. Didn't you ask for transitional fossils? Here they bloody well are, baby! Get your head out of your ass long enough to accept that this is exactly what we predict will happen in evolutionary theory. You have a period of time where critters stay relatively the same. Then, over a short geological time span, say 20 to 50 million years, which is short from a 4.6 billion year old planet's perspective, you see a proliferation of new species, often showing a clear move towards even more recent fossils of living organisms. And yet, you stand here and shout from the mountaintops that this is evidence against evolution? We are offering you a slew of animals that you can't properly call classic theropods, yet you also can't quite call them birds. They exist in between, and taxonomists argue over what we should call them. I can't make the case for evolution better than you are doing right now, you lying sack of shit. And I know you're lying, or at least your scriptwriter's lying. Because you can't see all of this while having any idea what evolutionary theory says and not see exactly what we expect to see. So carry on. Disappoint me further.
And then finally, there are other features of bird anatomy and theropod dinosaur anatomy that don't quite connect and don't quite support this evolutionary transition. One has to do with the structure of the foot. The structure of the bird foot is fundamentally different than the structure of the theropod foot, though superficially they look the same. The forelimbs in birds are much longer, and theropods they're much shorter. And then birds have a unique lung structure that is not found in anything else on the planet. And so when you look at these features, this also begins to weaken that link between theropods and birds.
See, here you go, misrepresenting and either being uninformed or lying. First, of course there are differences, Nimrod! If there were no differences, they wouldn't deserve getting a whole new name. Secondly, and critically, you left out that avian lungs are different from any other living animals. Conveniently, you let people draw the conclusion that they're therefore different from theropods as well. That's called a lie by omission. Now, we can't definitively show that non-avian theropod lungs are basically the same as avian lungs. That would require preserved soft tissues, a condition so improbable as to write it off right now. However, the chest cavity and other aspects of the skeletal structure can go a long way towards informing us about lung design. Guess what? There's at least one paper out there suggesting that theropods in early birds, such as Archaeopteryx, have a lung design about halfway between that of crocodiles and other earlier reptiles and modern birds. Fucking crocoduct again, you rube! So yeah, another one of your lies covers up the fact that we have solid evidence linking theropods to modern birds, and all of it in line with evolutionary theory!
Now, how do you explain then these feathered dinosaurs that exist in the fossil record and their superficial similarity to birds? Well, it could very well be that, again, these are feathered dinosaurs and that these feathers play an important role in the dinosaur biology. Maybe these serve as a form of insulation or help to stabilize these bipedal dinosaurs when they move around, providing some kind of aerodynamic support, helping them to balance while they're running at very fast speeds. So there's a number of possible reasons why these dinosaurs may have feathers that would reflect design, if you will, not necessarily an evolutionary connection. In fact, you could argue that if the dinosaurs and the birds are produced by a creator, you'd expect that creator to use similar designs in organisms that have similar anatomical and physiological requirements. And so you can account for these feathered dinosaurs as part of a creation model paradigm.
First off, those are good ideas for why a dinosaur might have feathers. That's actually in line with what evolutionary biologists expect. Organism A develops a feature that helps it do something. Over time, it gets co-opted to do something else in organism B. It's perfectly in line with what evolutionary model would predict. On the other hand, if it's all design, your god is a terrible engineer. But that's a subject for another video. The point here is that he's perfectly described how evolution explains feathered dinosaurs resulting in feathered birds. And again, there's no way he doesn't know all of this and know that we expect features to be co-opted to other purposes during the course of evolution. Such examples are evidence for evolution.
Something else that I believe is troubling when it comes to bird origins that undermines the evolutionary paradigm and I think at the same time supports a creation model view of the fossil record is the fact that, again, whenever we see the appearance of birds, they appear explosively. These are called radiation events by paleontologists. Archaeopteryx, as we said, shows up at about 155 million years ago, virtually out of nowhere. There is something shortly after Archaeopteryx appears that is known as the Cretaceous Radiation, where you have an explosive diversification of different bird forms that appear in the fossil record. There's another radiation that happens somewhere between 90 and 75 million years ago, where again we see an explosive diversification of new bird forms. And then finally, after dinosaurs go extinct at the KT extinction event about 65 million years ago, we see another radiation where modern birds appear for the very first time. These are called the Neo-Ornithines.
Cretaceous radiation? Yeah, there is such an event. At the end of the Cretaceous period about 66 million years ago! But that's the radiation of mammals to fill gaps left by the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs, you fucking shit! The Cretaceous period does see an expansion of birds, and the development of more modern bird characteristics than exhibited by those earliest birds. But we can't find anything that says there's justification for using the evolutionary term radiation. By the way, as we've discussed previously, such radiation events are precisely what we expect from evolution. The primary radiation of birds appears to be the Mesozoic, Cenozoic radiation, which applies actually to almost every modern species. It started somewhere in the Mesozoic era and continues to the present day, which is another interesting way that you mislead people. See, you present each of these radiations as very short-lived things that happen and are over quickly. The radiation of birds is part of a larger radiation that has been ongoing for as long as there has been such a thing as the archaic bird, and continues today. The Cretaceous radiation is a small chunk of this larger event, by the by. Radiations are not one-off events that occur in a short span of time and can be precisely pinned down to a specific date. Stop lying! Or at least cite the sources for your lies to lighten the burden of research I'm working under as to how this could be used to support The idea of a creator instead of evolution, it's one sadistic fucking creator, since most radiations depend on mass extinction events of the overwhelming majority of living organisms on Earth to be kick off.
And what you see here when we look at the natural history of birds is that the very first birds appear without any transitional intermediates leading up to them. They appear suddenly, and we see 3 radiation events in the natural history of birds where these are episodes of explosive diversification. This doesn't fit the evolutionary expectations of what the fossil record should look like, but fits perfectly a creation model paradigm where we would see a creator being involved in life's history and orchestrating life's history for his purposes. And if that's the case, then we'd expect explosive appearances, sudden appearances, explosive diversification.
We explained how you're misrepresenting and lying about all of this. We've discussed how explosion isn't spontaneous creation. In biology, explosion and radiation are things that happen over millions or tens of millions of years. When a biologist mentions an explosion, he's talking about an event that takes longer than all of human history and prehistory combined, by a factor of 1,000. If we could go from wolf to chihuahua in 10,000 years, why are you shocked when we go from tyrannosaur to chicken in 70 million years? To give you a hint, that's 7,000 times as long. I wish I could just say you don't understand, dude from Reasons to Believe, but you are demonstrating too much familiarity with this subject. You are either willfully ignoring the rest of the data and the conclusions it leads to, in which case you're lying to yourself, or you're just fucking lying to everyone. If you're right and the Christian God is real, you will burn in hell for all eternity just to defend this brand of creationism. You are bearing false witness and doing it in the Lord's name. You should be ashamed of yourself. Fucking hell, it took too much booze to make it through this pack of deceit and ignorance. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, I'll have a fistful of guests on in the next few weeks, including Lose Intelligence, Kind Heathen and Bloodwing, Falco in Flannel, and The World from Fur. I'm almost as ignorant as the rest of you about what's in their videos, but I enjoy their work on their own channels, and they all deserve larger audiences than they have, so consider this an endorsement not of what they say, but who they are. During this time, I'm not only going to be recharging my batteries, but experimenting with new ideas for this channel. You've already seen some of that in these recent videos. Gameplay won't be gone from all videos, but it will take a backseat to other things. As always, I'm InaneDragon, and I hope you've enjoyed this inanity. If so, make sure to subscribe for more of the same, and use the little bell to get harassed every time I upload. I don't care about no algorithm, but I do care what people are thinking, so make sure to leave a comment and rate this video, especially if you hate it. I want to know why. And if you've got money to burn, save the lighter fluid. I have a Patreon, and all proceeds from that get fed right back into this channel, one way or another. I do have some meager rewards for patronage, but nothing that would compromise my integrity or ethics. Other than that, good night, and happy fuck a slut day.